In this video, we will be exploring the redundancy principle and how it applies to e-learning. The redundancy principle 1 states that you should not add on-screen text to narrated graphics. Based on research in theory and cognitive psychology, both Clark and Mayer suggest that e-learning should avoid the use of redundant on-screen text presented at the same time as on-screen graphics and narration. One of the reasons for this suggestion is that when learners' eyes are focused on the printed words, the learner cannot be looking at the on-screen graphic at the same time, and when they attempt to do so, it will cause cognitive overload for the learner's processing. You can see on the left that with all of the text, this learner would get overwhelmed with trying to hear the spoken words while reading the words, whereas on the right, there would be no on-screen text, simply narration on what is going on with cell phones. The redundancy principle is also tied in with the dual-channel assumption theory. This theory states that people can process material through both their visual and auditory channels. When presenting a narration, that information is processed through the learner's auditory channels. When an image is viewed by the learner, that will be processed through the visual channel. Since the same information is processed through two separate channels, they can be combined in the learner's working memory with little cognitive load. But if the learner is overwhelmed with narration of an image alongside with on-screen text, this will flood the learner's visual channel, leading to overloading of the learner's processing capacity, which leads to failure to recall the information. If the learner is overwhelmed with narration of an image alongside the on-screen text, this will flood the learner's visual channel, leading to overloading of the learner's processing capacity, which leads to failure to recall the information. The psychology of Principle 1 deals with the difference between the learning styles view and information acquisition theory compared to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. In the learning styles view of learning, people are assumed to have visual or auditory learning styles, so having both modes available would be helpful for learning. This, combined with the information acquisition theory that states that 3 ways of delivering information is better than 2, leads people to believe that you should have both visual and auditory information at the same time. However, this theory falsely assumes that people learn as though the mind were an empty vessel simply waiting to be filled with incoming information. Opposed to this is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning that makes 3 assumptions. The first is that all people have separate channels for processing visual and verbal material. The second is that each channel has a limited amount of processing that can occur at once. And 3, learners try to build pictorial and verbal models and build connections between them. In this theory, adding extra information through redundant text could overload the visual channel, which is called the extraneous cognitive load, and thus waste processing capacity. The redundancy principle number 2 states that adding on-screen text to a narration can be added in specific situations. There are 4 scenarios where this would be okay. In fact, sometimes having the both on-screen text and narration can be helpful to the learner to have some redundancy. But the 4 cases where this would be potentially beneficial or at least okay would be when there's no pictorial presentation on the screen, or when there's ample opportunity to process the text and graphics. If students are going at a slow speed, or if students are able to learn at their own pace, then they would have the appropriate time to process both the text and the graphics. It's also appropriate when there are keywords or shortened summaries. And finally, if the learner would exert more cognitive effort to comprehend spoken text. The psychology behind Principle 2 is that if spoken material is difficult to process or is unfamiliar, such as in a technical context, having dual modes of presentation is actually a benefit. Also, if the material is presented slowly or at the learner's pace, Having those dual modes can be helpful because the learner has time to process without overloading the learner. And finally, the use of signaling can actually direct the learner's attention to a particular part of a graphic to aid in learning. Some of the research for Principle 1 is this redundancy effect, which is the idea that adding redundant on-screen text to narrated graphics will hurt the learning process, not help it. Clark and Mayer covered multiple studies in their text surrounding the use of redundant information in multimedia lessons. Each of the studies concluded with the same outcome, that students in the non-redundant group performed better than those in the redundant group. Due to the limited capacity of the human information processing system, at times in e-learning, the approach of less is more is often the answer when it comes to reducing cognitive overload of learning material. The redundancy effect would also suggest that it could be better to present less graphics with corresponding narration than more graphics with corresponding narration alongside text. While this principle focuses heavily on omitting redundant on-screen text, this is not an end-all be-all to including on-screen text to narrations, as Principle 2 introduced that there are special situations where the use of text in narration could be considered. Some of the research for Principle 2 showed that in certain situations, learners could generate 3 times as many correct answers on a problem-solving transfer test from a presentation that was using both spoken and written word. Because of these results, there is a call for a revised redundancy principle. This would allow for short amounts of text next to the corresponding parts of the graphics. On the right side of this screen would be an appropriate example for the graphics for a lesson on the empirical rule in statistics. The associated audio could be that when a population follows a normal distribution, 68% of the data fall within 1 standard deviation of the mean, 95% of the data fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean, and 99.7% of the data fall within 3 standard deviations of mean. In this example, the principles are not violated because the labeling of the graphic is signaling to the learner what to focus on as the words are spoken. In this example, the additional text does not provide any signaling or any clarification that is not provided through the audio. In fact, it can distract the learner and can take away from their ability to process both the audio and the visual. Now that we've discussed the redundancy principle, the first question for you to consider what you've learned is to answer, when is it better to use dual modes of presenting information? Your second question is, why do learners struggle with redundant text when present with graphics, on-screen text, and auditory information? This concludes the video on the redundancy principle. Thank you for joining me today.